In the 1960s, China was in turmoil during the Glorious Revolution, but they still began to look abroad to expand their influence. Early on, Mao had established relations with new countries like Pakistan, Algeria, and Ghana, yet Maoist influence would soon spread across the developing world. In Africa, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania welcomed China, as he saw the Russians as just a new version of white imperialists. The Chinese also began sending aid to countries like Zambia and Sudan. But possibly more important was China's help to revolutionary groups in Africa at that time. For instance, Isaias Afewerki, the current president of Eritrea, was trained in China before returning to fight in the decades-long independence war against the Ethiopians. Those who were trained in China also brought back the party-army model, which is the idea that the army should belong to the party and not the country. So rulers like Afewerki would use this to, like the CCP, stay in power for a very long time. Other potential allies were Gaddafi of Libya, who tried unsuccessfully to buy Chinese nuclear weapons in 1970. Yet he was clearly inspired by the Chinese, as he launched his own cultural revolution with his own little green book. Another leader that grew close to China and was inspired by them was Mobutu of Zaire. China, however, had in fact aided the Simba rebellion against him alongside the Soviets in the 1960s. But by this point, Mao was willing to work with anti-communists fighting against Soviet influence. Mobutu even visited China and began wearing Mao suits, called himself citizen, and nationalized a great deal of the industry in Zaire. In later years, China would join Mobutu in supplying aid to Angolan rebels. Again, the Chinese used to work with the Soviets there, helping the MPLA rebels fight against the Portuguese. But now they supported a new rebel group, UNITA, alongside Zaire and the Americans. So even when the Portuguese left Angola, these two groups would continue to fight against each other until 2002. Even in the West, Maoism continued to grow, especially in France after their riots in 1968, or in the USA among groups like the Black Panthers. One member, Elaine Brown, visited China during the Glorious Revolution and reported back, old and young would spontaneously give emotional testimonies, like Baptist converts, to the glories of socialism. Closer to home, Maoism was gaining a sizable following in countries like Cambodia, where Pol Pot copied Mao's peasant-style revolution in his fight against the government. Laos was also going through civil war, but their communists were more inclined to support the Vietnamese, where China had lost all their influence. There were many reasons as to why China had lost all of their influence in northern Vietnam. For one, the Red Guard attacked a Vietnamese consulate, and the Viet Cong refused to follow Mao's instructions on how to conduct the war. So Mao cut off aid to Ho Chi Minh in the late 60s and turned his attention to the Soviet Union, who he almost went to war with in 1969. There were many reasons as to why this war almost broke out, but just to summarize, the Sino-Soviet split had divided the communist world. The Soviet Union feared China's nuclear weapons, Mao was eradicating all moderates, and still viewed the USSR as their main threat, while the Soviets in 1968 lost a lot of support from within the communist world for cracking down on the Prague Spring. Mao then instigated small border clashes, but for an unknown reason. Maybe he wanted to push China to the forefront of the communist world, or he just believed that he could use his huge revolutionary militias. We really don't know. Whatever the reason, they ambushed Soviet troops near Zhenbao Island, then months later along the borders of Xinjiang. Brezhnev, outraged by these actions, was actually debating the use of nuclear weapons. The situation calmed down though when Ho Chi Minh died in 1969. Both communist nations sent ambassadors to the funeral, and there they agreed to end hostilities. Mao, however, still believed that a war was coming, so he gave further powers to Lin Biao to build up the PLA, while he looked to mending relations with the United States. Back in Southeast Asia though, KMT soldiers were still in Laos, controlling the opium trade after being defeated in Burma. Some ethnic Chinese remained in Burma though, like Kun Sa, who had his own powerful militia in the Shan state. He then crossed into KMT lands and fighting broke out, starting the Opium War of 1967. In the end though, the Laotian government bombed both sides, and then Thai troops helped mop up the KMT drug traders. Further south, communist insurrections continued to spread into Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines and Indonesia, but with no success. Marcos of Philippines, for instance, would declare martial law to fight against them, and in Indonesia, the crackdown led to the deaths of maybe 1 million people. As for Burma, their leaders had always been close to China. For instance, Ne Win initiated the Burmese way to socialism. However, many began to fear that China was spreading their cultural revolution, which led to anti-Chinese riots in 1967. Mao quickly began supporting communist guerrillas, but infighting led to their downfall, and eventually relations would be repaired. Further west in India, there was a communist uprising in Naxalbari. They received support from the Chinese, and their leader, Chara Mazumdar, even wrote, "China enabled the revolutionaries all over India to unite. China's chairman is our chairman, and China's path is our path." So their insurgency continued, spreading down what has been called the Red Corridor, and it actually still rages today, even encouraging further rebellions in Nepal. In that country, the Maoists, after a long civil war, would be given a place in the government. There were also other Maoist groups nearby, like in Sri Lanka, but Mao continued to support the ruling government there and maintained close relations, so the rebels received no support. But going back to China, just across the border lay British Hong Kong and Portuguese Macau. They had been swamped with refugees ever since the communist takeover. In Hong Kong, for instance, their population grew from 750,000 in 1945 to over 3 million in 1961. Tensions grew worse inside the country and resulted in the 1956 riots, which saw KMT supporters and communists clash on the streets and even attack foreigners. Then in 1967, communist sympathizers and trade unions went on strike. Clashes soon erupted, and then the riot police were called in. Some high-ranking generals, like Huang Yongsheng, hoped to exploit the situation and invade. Communist Red Guards were sent to attack the border police, hoping to cause a response. But the well-trained Gurkhas on the Hong Kong border that July did not return fire. But the riots continued, and the communists even placed bombs throughout the city. So the British declared martial law and launched raids on their headquarters. In the end though, Zhou Enlai, who was already worried about the spread of violence in China, ordered the protesters in Hong Kong to stop. In the wake of these riots, the British decided a change of policy was in order. Beforehand, Governor Copperthwaite favoured laissez-faire capitalism, and this did allow Hong Kong's economy to grow. But thousands were left impoverished and unrest was growing. So when Murray MacLehose came to power, he reversed all of this. They built the mass transit system, introduced subsidised housing, compulsory education and the likes. And people were given a say, albeit small, in elections for members of the Urban Council. Yet the Hong Kong riots of '67 were probably inspired by events in nearby Macau. This small colony had just introduced the Grand Prix and casinos in the '60s, finally allowing it to grow. But the Portuguese segregated their school children along ethnic lines. In December 1966, when the authorities stopped the construction of a new school, riots erupted. The Portuguese were able to restore order, but in the grand scale of things, this was a great defeat. Chinese soldiers were sent to prevent the Red Guard from attacking the colony, and Salazar of Portugal knew this. So his governor sent an apology to Mao and agreed to defend the ethnically Chinese businessmen. This group made a great deal of money and quickly began to take over the day-to-day running of the colony. Across the straits, Chiang Kai-shek was watching all of this unfold. And he had already been dealt a huge propaganda blow when his old comrade and enemy Li Zhongren visited communist China. Many other warlords like Yan Jishan and Bai Chongxi had already died, while those who remained in Taiwan like Shen Shikai from Xinjiang were barely popular. Or there was Ma Bufang, who was still alive, but he had moved to Saudi Arabia. These were pretty much the remnants of the old warlords. So Li's visit to the mainland was a huge blow to Chiang, but the lack of prominent leaders did allow him to continue to rule as an authoritarian, maintain martial law, and continue to arrest communists during his White Terror. Yet he still saw himself as the rightful ruler of United China, and to reclaim it, he set up Project National Glory in 1961. This was a plan to invade Xiamen in a surprise attack, and then just hope millions of people would rise up in his support. Plus, it should be said that Chiang still held claims to Tuva and Mongolia. For instance, in the 1950s, he prevented Mongolia from joining the United Nations. And he also claimed the small islands in the South China Sea, which the Communist Party still controversially lay claim to today. The claims to these islands date back to the end of World War II, when the KMT were looking to expand their influence in the vacuum that the Japanese left behind. So they sent ships to the islands when the Japanese surrendered, but before this, the islands were barely inhabited. The first bases on the Parcel Islands, for instance, were French when they ruled Vietnam, while the Spratly Islands were claimed by both the Vietnamese and the Chinese in the 1800s. But fishermen from various countries used them, and then weirdly it was claimed by one of the world's first micronations, the Republic of Morak Songrati Medes. This was set up in the late 1800s, and the family continued to petition leaders, including Chiang Kai-shek, to recognize their independence. The original KMT claims to these islands, though, were shown by an 11-dash line, while the communists changed it to 9 dashes after making a deal with the Vietnamese. Now, however, the islands, or at least parts of them, are claimed by nearly every country in the region. So Chiang had some bold plans, and in 1965 he sent troops to Jinmen Island, prepping for an invasion. But their ships were intercepted, men died on exercise, and the plans were put on hold. He knew that he needed American assistance, and to entice them, he made promises to join in the Vietnam War. However, his plan was to invade Guangdong Province, the old homeland of the KMT, hoping to cut off supplies to the Viet Cong. The Americans still refused, though, but Chiang still hoped to exploit the turmoil caused by the Cultural Revolution. Many of his advisors, though, believed that only if they could create a powerful economy that they could potentially hope for a Hungarian-style revolution on the mainland and have the capacity of supporting an invasion. Lee Kuo-ting was instrumental in guiding Taiwan from an agrarian society to a world leader in technology, allowing their GDP to grow 10% every year. To show their growth as a comparison, in 1950, their GDP per capita was $1,500. The Democratic Republic of Congo had $1,000 per person, and Bolivia's was over $3,000. Well, by 1970, Congo was only $1,200, Bolivia was $3,400, but Taiwan was over $4,000. By 1990, they were at $16,000, while Congo was below $1,000 and Bolivia was still at $3,400. To do this, major businesses and banks were nationalized. Gold reserves and American aid prevented them from suffering from hyperinflation again, and land was redistributed to alleviate poverty. Plus, new businesses were being established by mainland refugees, and strong ties to Japan, Thailand, Philippines, and South Korea also helped with trade and investment from abroad. With all of this new wealth, they made welfare reforms, and their economy grew so much that American aid was stopped. They also would later embark on the 10 major construction projects, including new railway lines, highways, ports, nuclear power plants, and more. However, as they imported nuclear reactors from countries like Canada and uranium from South Africa, they would also begin to secretly work on a nuclear weapons program. This, however, would later be discovered and abandoned. Yet, despite their new wealth, no rebellion on the mainland came, and in 1969, Chiang Kai-shek was involved in a road accident, forcing him to step back from politics and the plan to be shelved. Yet, by this point, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution had ended, and Mao had cemented his control over the party and population. But Mao, by now, was in his 80s, and he needed a successor. At the 9th National Congress, he selected Lin Biao, but Lin now had to struggle for power against the Cultural Revolution group. Madame Mao, for instance, didn't like him, and she was formidable in the government. For instance, she also didn't like Zhou Enlai, so she had his children murdered by the Red Guards and continued to make sure Zhou could not achieve any great power. But now she had to deal with Lin's growing power. As the head of the military, he had a lot of support from many of the officers, and then he was joined by Chen Boda, the chairman of the Cultural Revolution group. This made his faction even more powerful than Zhou Enlai's and Madame Mao's. But this new power also made Mao immediately suspicious. So he denied Lin's advice to take the title of president, a title which had been out of use since the fall of Liu Shaoqi, believing this was Lin's attempt to grab power. Chen Boda was then purged, and then Mao decided to rehabilitate civilians and party members that Lin had persecuted. This now portrayed Lin as the most violent member of the Politburo. Then, to completely undermine Lin's politics, Mao even looked to repair relations with the United States. Then, Lin made the mistake of criticizing Mao's wife at the next conference. After this, Mao made his move. The officers loyal to Lin were forced to do self-criticism, and then Lin died in a plane crash in September 1971. But what happened is a mystery. The official story claims that Lin had attempted to assassinate Mao and then defect to the Soviet Union, but his plane ran out of fuel and crashed in Mongolia. This alleged coup attempt was called Project 571. However, nobody really knows exactly what happened. Some sources say that the coup was real and the Soviets were involved, and they killed him in China when it failed. Others say he was killed in the plane crash, but it was travelling away from the USSR, not towards it. And some speculate he was on his way to Taiwan, but accidentally crashed. Whatever the case may be, all those loyal to Lin were purged. But his death did mark a great shift among the population. Many began to see that the government was not always constantly correct, so the cult of personality began to disappear. Madame Mao tried to restore the prestige of her husband by launching the Criticize Lin, Criticize Confucius campaign, which also attacked Zhou Enlai. But Mao suffered from a stroke in late 1971, and he still had no successor. So he rehabilitated many of his former comrades, while Zhou Enlai became his number 2. Plus, with Lin now gone, Mao and Zhou Enlai finally accepted Kissinger's invitation to meet with Nixon. The two had actually established links with one another via ping-pong diplomacy, as an American team was invited to play in the capital. This Sino-American agreement would help both nations bring an end to the Vietnam War and push back their mutual enemy, the Soviet Union. Plus, by now, the global situation had completely changed thanks to Albania. They approached the United Nations demanding that the PRC be recognized as the official China. In their words, the reality should not be changed to suit the myth of a so-called Republic of China, fabricated out of a portion of Chinese territory. So, the United Nations had a vote on which China should be recognized. The communist world, most of Europe, including the UK and France, Iran, India, half of Africa, and many more voted on behalf of the communist. Now Mao's PRC was the officially recognized China, taking their place alongside America, France, Britain, and the USSR on the Permanent Council. The following year, Nixon visited Beijing to meet Mao, who joked, "I believe our old friend Chiang Kai-shek would not approve of this." The whole trip was televised and proved to be the deciding factor in many countries recognizing Mao's government as legitimate, rather than Chiang Kai-shek's, including even Franco of Spain. Then, after the deals were made, panda diplomacy helped increase China's soft power around the world. This is when the Chinese just loaned pandas to foreign zoos, where they would usually be met by some high-ranking official, or in the United States case, by Pat Nixon. Japan also normalized relations with the communists around this time. Prime Minister Tanaka acknowledged damage his nation had caused to China, and in return, the Chinese dropped their demands for reparations. However, as China moved to formalize relations with the West, they lost their oldest ally, Albania. They had helped get the CCP into the United Nations, but now they were angry with Mao for signing a deal with, in their words, a frenzied anti-communist. Obviously though, their relations with the United States were now far more important. But it led to the complicated one China policy of the United States and many countries. In the words of the Americans, the United States acknowledges that Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. The United States does not challenge that position. In later years, though, the Taiwan's Relations Act and Reagan's 6 assurances promised to trade with and protect Taiwan. Japan and other nations had equally ambiguous policies, one which recognizes only one China, but deals with two. This, by the way, has a name: strategic ambiguity, and it has the benefit of deliberately not revealing any potential responses to any potential action. Yet, as part of their repaired relations with China, the Americans did agree to stop funding Tibetan rebels, ending much of their hopes for independence. But there was foreign involvement in other uprisings, as the Soviets turned to funding the rebels in Xinjiang. Independence groups like the United Revolutionary Front of East Turkestan was already based in Kazakhstan and received a great deal of support. The Chinese responded to this by forcing Han people to live in the region, increasing their numbers from 7% of the population to over 40%. Many of these were settled on the border, creating a buffer zone between the Uyghurs and their fellow Turkic people across the border in Kazakhstan. This is how the situation would remain until the mid-70s. But then everything would change in 1975 and 76, as Chiang Kai-shek, Zhou Enlai, and finally Mao Zedong would all die. In Taiwan, Chiang was eventually succeeded by his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, who continued many of the economic policies of his father. In fact, it was him that launched the 10 major construction projects. He also began to move Taiwan towards more liberal ideas, like relaxing laws on freedom of speech. While on the mainland, thousands of people mourned the death of Zhou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping gave a eulogy at his funeral, placing him firmly on the side of the moderates. Deng had already been purged during the Cultural Revolution, and only made his way back into politics recently thanks to Zhou Enlai. He then quickly climbed up the party ladder and found himself as Mao's number 2. The Gang of Four obviously didn't like this. They had already stopped many people from publicly mourning Zhou Enlai's death, but they believed that many people would use the Qingming festival as an excuse to mourn him, as this festival is traditionally when people pay homage to ancestors. The gang published articles attacking both Zhou and Deng, but mourners still gathered in Nanking and in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. When the police removed wreaths and memorials to Zhou, the people rioted, starting the Tiananmen incident of 1976. Police dispatched the crowds while Deng Xiaoping was blamed for orchestrating the entire thing, so Hua Guofeng was named the new successor to Mao. He had been the governor of Hunan and later Minister of Public Security, but really he had very little power. Yet with Mao's health failing, he did begin to plot against the Gang of Four, believing they would do the same to him if he didn't act first. Luckily for him, many others also hated the gang, like the defense minister, the head of the elite 8341 Corps, the head of the military in Beijing, and Li Jianin, the vice premier. Then Mao himself died in September 1976, and this new faction made their move. They invited members of the gang to a meeting and arrested them, while Mao's widow was arrested in her home. They were brought to trial in 1980 and imprisoned, where Madame Mao killed herself. Hua Guofeng and his new allies were now in charge of the country, and he ordered that he be called the Wise Leader, and ordered that his photo should be placed next to Mao's in public. Internationally, he visited Europe, meeting leaders like Thatcher. But domestically, his constitution continued to call for continuous revolution, and he almost brought China backwards by looking to instigate a new Soviet-inspired 5 or even 10-year plan. He made himself even more unpopular by issuing the 2 whatevers, promising to uphold whatever decision Mao made and instruction he had. This went completely against the growing number of people who were advocating for market reforms, led by the recently rehabilitated Deng Xiaoping. So Deng led his allies to peacefully usurp power from Hua in 1978, at a meeting of the Central Committee. At this meeting, the leaders agreed to pretty much follow Deng Xiaoping's vision of China, like the 4 modernizations, which should, in theory, turn China into a powerful socialist nation by the end of the century. Denounced people were rehabilitated, whether or not they were dead or alive, like Peng Dehui and Bo Yi-do. Hua's image was removed from schools, ending the cult of personality. There was also the Democracy Wall in Beijing, where people posted big character posters, initially criticizing the Gang of Four, and eventually calling for all sorts of reforms. Many scientists were brought back to work, university exams were re-established, and he called on the people to seek truth for themselves, rather than relying on the word of one man. In this far more liberal climate, people began printing and distributing their own newspapers, albeit very small. And many demanded more, including a 5th modernization, as well as agriculture, industry, defense, and science, which Deng Xiaoping advocated for. They also wanted democracy. More importantly, though, the party agreed to end the continuous class struggles in favor of economic reform. All of this was part of Boluan Fangzhen, or eliminating chaos and returning to normal. Deng was able to introduce all of these reforms despite not really having power. However, they proved so popular that in 1981 he was officially made leader. But once becoming leader, not everything was so great for the people. Deng later launched the Strike Hard anti-crime campaign in 1983, when tens of thousands were sentenced to death to quell growing crime and political dissent. And possibly the most problematic change was the one-child policy. Previously, Mao had gave out mixed messages on having children. For instance, in the 1960s, when the United Nations held a conference on population control, the Chinese called it an imperialist tactic to keep the third world countries down. But sometimes he encouraged women in China to have fewer children or space them out so they could work more. To this end, barefoot doctors, who were usually just high school graduates, were sent out into the countryside. They helped with all sorts of basic treatments, but also aided in abortions. They would sometimes use traditional medicines like blister beetles, or, more often than not, an overdose of malaria medicine. But the population seems to have doubled during Mao's rule, from 500 million to 900 million in 1976. So many people began to turn to the works of the economist Ma Ying-chu, who long called for population control. However, as it was usually ideological economists like Chen Yun who supported the plan, some speculate that the population crisis was fabricated. So maybe the real reason behind the policy was to limit the population and thus make it easier to achieve their modernizing goals. Plus, generations of wealth would be consolidated rather than spread out between many children, thus eliminating a lot of poverty. So, in 1980, the policy was put into place. Contraception was made readily available, especially IUDs, which were given to 300 million women. On top of that, 100 million people were sterilized, sometimes in exchange for cash payments. But those who went on to have a second child were made to either have an abortion or pay huge fines. These fines, called the social child raising fee, could be huge in cities, the equivalent of a couple years' salary. So generally, richer people could afford to have 2 children. If any child was born illegally, they'd have no internal passport and therefore they couldn't get a job or receive an education. Plus, their parents could lose their job as well. There were some exemptions given though. For instance, if their first child was disabled, or if they lived in the countryside, where the rules were a little more relaxed. Because of these policies, the fertility rate quickly fell, from 2.8 to 1.5. However, it's also caused huge social issues. For starters, Chinese parents had long preferred to have sons over daughters, and they even used to drown their daughters in a practice known as ni nu. This was back in the 19th century, when missionaries reported that in some provinces, 1/3 of baby girls were killed. There are many reasons behind this. For instance, Confucianism did lay the responsibility of helping parents in their old age at the feet of men, so daughters were seen as more of a burden. In 1980, the communist government even acknowledged that these beliefs still exist, especially as the rates of female abandonment and infanticide spiked. So it's believed that 22% of pregnancies ended in abortion, especially if they knew that they were going to have a girl. This has left China with far too many men compared to women. Plus, on top of that, China now has an aging and declining population in the 21st century. But going back to Deng's more liberal reforms, in a way they could be compared to Gorbachev's perestroika. However, Deng limited the extent of change by creating special economic zones. These were in cities like Shenzhen, which was only a small town but quickly became one of the richest cities and home to companies like Huawei. Now China was opened up, they went from being the world's 32nd largest exporter to the 13th by 1990. But still their GDP lagged behind countries like Japan, Brazil, Italy and Canada. Meanwhile, with Britain's lease on Hong Kong running out, he met with Margaret Thatcher, and she agreed to hand it back to China in 1997. China did promise to respect Hong Kong laws for the following 50 years, but this isn't exactly happening. The Portuguese then followed suit a couple years later and agreed to give them Macau in 1999. Further afield, Pol Pot took power in Cambodia and remained one of China's staunchest allies, even as he killed millions of his own population. But in 1978, the Vietnamese invaded the country. Deng Xiaoping, who was moderate, did blame Pol Pot for being too radical, but he was still obliged to attack northern Vietnam to aid the Khmer Rouge. Deng even threatened war with the USSR if they got involved, but the Sino-Vietnamese War was short. China declared victory after capturing a little bit of land and returned home, while Vietnam continued to invade Cambodia and occupy the country for 10 years. 1979 was also when the Rhodesian Bush War ended. During this war, the Soviets supported Joshua and Nkomo in their fight against the white minority. while China supported Mugabe. The Chinese even helped train his Zanla party in guerrilla tactics, helping Mugabe eventually emerge victorious. China did though lose an ally in Somalia. They went to war with communist Ethiopia, which was an ally with the USSR. The Ethiopians won this war, the Ogaden War, leaving Somalia in a state of chaos and unrest for decades. However, the Eritreans were on the verge of gaining their independence from Ethiopia, giving the Chinese another ally in the region. More importantly though, in the late 70s, the Soviets moved into Afghanistan. The Chinese were already angered by the Soviets for many reasons, including their funding of East Turkestan independence groups. So the Chinese, alongside the Americans, sent money and weapons to the Mujahideen throughout the 80s. The Soviets would only pull out of the country once Gorbachev came to power in the mid-80s, and he tried to repair relations with China. To do this, he conceded quite a lot, like withdrawing troops from Mongolia, and then he even agreed to visit Beijing in 1989. But the Chinese were also repairing relations elsewhere. Like in 1983, they normalized relations with South Korea, but for a very weird reason. That year, Chinese passengers hijacked a plane and demanded that the pilot fly them to Taiwan. The pilot, however, tried to land in North Korea, but the hijackers forced him to South Korea, which was in a state of turmoil. Inside that country, there were democracy movements, coups, and martial law. But because of the hijacking, China and South Korea set up diplomatic channels and normalized relations, greatly angering the North. In fact, China by this point was largely turning its back on the North in favor of their deals with richer capitalist nations. Deng had therefore opened up China to the world and set them on their path to their economic miracle. However, he would soon have to deal with a great deal of unrest.